Well, howdy doody and hello to Yudi. What's going on with the screen there? Let's see if we can figure that one out. There we go. Let's talk about drought management. So we know about drought and how many negative impacts it has, but how can we manage drought? Here's some learning goals. You're going to know how governments, farmers, and regular citizens can respond to drought. And you're going to be able to create and interpret a map. So you're going to actually make your own map and write a few sentences explaining that map. Right, so first way that we can manage drought is stuff the government does. They could connect all the water sources with pipes, and then they could move that water to where it's needed. So if you connect up all of your dams and all of your reservoirs and all your pipes all together, then you've got flexibility. All that area needs some water, boom, we can send it to them with pipes. And Queensland have done that, and I'll show you a picture of that in a sec. We can recycle water. It's very common to recycle water. Australians are a bit scared of drinking recycled water. They think, oh no, I'm drinking booze and wheeze. You're not really, it's recycled. But lots of countries overseas use recycled water for drinking water, but in Australia it's not that common. Recycled water can be used for other uses like farming, flushing toilets. It's not often used for drinking though. We can desalinate water. We can remove salt from seawater and use that for drinking water. Very expensive. And finally, we can apply water restrictions. So the government can apply water restrictions. They can go, you can only use, if you can remember back to the last drought, when they'd be like, you can't water your garden in the daytime, blah, blah, blah. Or they could, and another way to restrict water use is by increasing the price. Now, that's all well and good. Of course, not everybody is the same amount of money, so increasing the price would harm poor people more, and that's not good. Here is an example of the giant water pipe system they have in southeast Queensland. So they've connected lots of pipes to reservoirs and dams, and they can pump that water all around the state. Here's an example of a water recycling factory. So that's somewhere in Australia, I can't remember where. So you've got water in all these big tanks, and they clean it, give it back to you. This is Melbourne's desalination plant, and I just found out those stats on what it costs, so I thought I'd include them because they're pretty shocking. It costs $4 billion to build, and it costs about $608 million a year, even if it doesn't produce any water. So that's like $500,000 a day. No, that's almost $2 million a day, sorry. So this desalination plant, even if it's not turned on and not producing water, costs about $2 million a day to run. What can farmers do to resist drought? Firstly, they can plant drought-tolerant plants, i.e. grow things that don't need much water. Simple. It's easier for us residents who can just, our gardens are often just for decoration. It's easy to find decoration plants that don't need much water, but finding crop plants that don't need much water, that's a bit more tricky. They can reduce irrigation loss. If you remember, up to half of water is wasted based on the way that it's irrigated. If you just spray it into the air and let it land on the ground, a lot gets wasted, it gets blown away. Or if you have drip irrigation straight into the soil, that's much more efficient. Thirdly, they can use cover crops. So a lot of moisture in the soil is lost through evaporation, but if you leave plants on there the whole time, so you never let that soil go bare, then it keeps the soil in, keeps the moisture in. I'll show you some photos of what I'm talking about. This little experiment a farmer is doing with some drought-resistant crops, so crops that don't need as much water to grow. Here's just a little piece of information about irrigation. Drip irrigation can be much more efficient. It's more expensive to put in the first place because you've got to put all these little drip hoses everywhere. Maybe you've got some drip hosing in your own house. Finally, this is cover crops. So when this is in between the times that you're growing crops that you actually want on there, rather than just leaving the soil bare, you grow something on it like grass or certain kinds of weeds and stuff, and that keeps the moisture in the soil. And then you can just mow it down or whatever when you want to plant something that you actually want to sell. There you go. So that's government action, farmer action. Now, personal action. Now, we've already talked about this in an earlier video, so I'm not going to go on about this too much, but here's just a few more suggestions. A dual flush toilet, so the toilets where you got the little flush for number ones and the big flush for number twos. It's a good idea, because then every time you just do a number one, you only use half as much water. Some people put a brick in the toilet cistern so that it takes up some space so that there's not as much water for each flush. Don't run taps if not needed, so if you're washing your hands or brushing your teeth, don't just keep the tap running. And as mentioned, don't water the garden when it's hot. When it's really hot, if you water the garden in the middle of the day when it's hot, most of that water is going to evaporate before it even gets to the plant, so it's a waste. If you water it at night or early in the morning when it's not as hot, the water will have a chance to seep into the soil, go into the roots of the plant before it evaporates. There are a few water saving tips for you. Activity time. You're going to make a map. So get a blank outline map of Australia. You can get that from wherever you want. Simple Google search will find that. Or you can use that link there. There's an outline map there. And you're going to recreate. I want you to have a go at recreating an existing map. So go to that link. That map is a map of drought in Australia, and I want you to try and recreate it, but you must include bolts. It's got to have a border around the outside, an orientation, which way is north, a legend, what your colours mean, a title, what's the map about, the scale, how big is 100k, and what's the source of information, and you'll know the source of information when you click on that link. Once you've made your map, you write 3 or 4 sentences explaining what we can learn from that map. Good luck. Okay, a video for you. It's drought in Australia. This is from BTN, that's behind the news. Take it away.
It's 4 in the morning. While you're still fast asleep, these sisters are pulling on their boots and venturing out into the paddocks on their farm to feed their sheep, goats, cattle and horses.
Yeah, we help Mum and Dad as much as we can. You know, feeding stock, making sure everything's watered and kept up to date.
Heidi, Eliza and Ruby live on a farm right here in outback New South Wales. In case you haven't heard, the state is really dry right now. In fact, 98% of it is either in drought or drought affected. And it's a similar story in big parts of Victoria, South Australia and Queensland. The scorched, dry land creates some amazing scenes from up in the air. But closer up, the reality is far less beautiful.
Sometimes it's sad when you have to see like lambs being pulled or them dying.
It's dry.
Yeah.
The whole property's dry. No green at all.
When there's no grass for the farm animals to eat, farmers have to buy hay and feed them by hand. It means these guys don't get much downtime.
We have to do a lot of stuff at school, and then when we get home, then we have to do a lot more jobs.
I like it because it gives me something to do, but it's very busy. Like they said.
Yeah, you're never bored.
Yeah.
A drought's what happens when not enough rain falls over a long period of time and it leads to a shortage of water. What not enough rain means depends on the average rainfall for that area. So even if it does happen to rain in the coming weeks or months, it doesn't necessarily mean the drought will be broken. Australia is the driest inhabited continent in the world. On average, we're hit with a severe drought once every 18 years. The worst one on record, the Millennium Drought, wasn't all that long ago. It happened between 2003 and 2012. Back then, water shortages got so bad that many farms went out of business, and in some areas, big desalination plants were built to turn seawater into drinking water. Farmers say this drought has them struggling to make ends meet, so now our leaders are taking action. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's announced relief measures for farmers across the country.
But we've got to make sure that when times get really tough, we give them the tools to enable them to carry on and get to the other side of the drought.
And in New South Wales, Premier Gladys Berejiklian says the state government will find $500 million for affected families. That money will go towards getting things like food and water to livestock. The government's also cutting a bunch of fees that farmers would normally have to pay to run their farms. It's impossible to say how long this drought might last. Even with the financial aid, Heidi, Eliza and Ruby know there's plenty of hard work ahead. But despite the challenges, they say there's nowhere else they'd rather live.
We love it out here. Even though we are in drought and it is hard and we are very busy, like, we wouldn't change it.
And it's time for a quick reflection activity. Write reflection activity down, and I want you to do a think, puzzle, explore with the topic of drought management. So when you're thinking about how we manage droughts, what do you think? I think blah, blah, blah. Something that still puzzles me about drought management is blah, blah, blah. And finally, I'd like to explore blah, blah, blah further. Just complete those 3 quick short sentences, and that is your reflection activity. Thank you for taking part in today's lesson. Always make sure you're keeping it real.